I'm Christian Scholl. I'm a lecturer at the University of Amsterdam, and I'm teaching political science, specifically social movements and gender studies.
Okay.
I met Mark Kennedy a few times in the preparation phase towards the G8 protests in Germany, and while having known him and having seen him operating also, indeed I was totally not aware in those times that he was operating. I have to say that he was operating extremely well. It's a masterpiece of police work what he did. I mean, so many years, so deeply involved in so many countries, contributing, participating and monitoring to so many protests. It's quite an amazing job. I wouldn't have guessed so. Having heard about it last year and realizing, well, this guy was a cop, it makes you, for sure your first reaction is, wow, what the fuck, I didn't expect that, and what an asshole. But I guess this doesn't help you really further. My personal take on this always has been to try to keep the paranoia that immediately is waning in you, to try to keep that really out and to say, look, we know that the state is doing these kind of things. Social movements will always be monitored, and so whether this is nowadays by monitoring your email or having somewhere a secret video camera in front of your door or elsewhere, or by actual infiltrants, by actual undercover cops, or by paying people for giving them information who are not cops but involved in social movements, it doesn't matter so much. It doesn't matter so much, but what really is interesting is to understand how that works and what kind of dynamics were going on, and yeah, maybe this way find effective ways to avoid that more in the future. But I think there is no way of totally avoiding that. Social movements need to be open. It's like President Kennedy who said, who makes peaceful resistance impossible, makes violent upheaval inevitable. And this is very, very important to keep in mind, because I think, for example, the confrontational methods that were applied to summit protests, anti-globalization activists trying to disrupt these summit meetings of the G8, of the World Bank and so on at the end of the 90s, were clearly a reaction to the pacification of protest in Europe that has taken place throughout the 80s and early 90s. Social movements focusing more on negotiating, on forming NGOs, on trying to bargain directly with governments, on having peaceful protests with no disruptive means once in a while. These were methods that were very much controlled and very much managed by the state, and social movement realized that some of their goals and some of their targets wouldn't be met like this. And so they started to apply more disruptive tactics again, and so governments started to respond to that, and that meant to shift a little bit their repertoire of social control. I think generally we have to accept the fact that the shift of police being used as a repressive agency in order to stifle dissent is taking place. I mean, this is a shift that has been taking place in the past 100 years or so. So this is nothing new. And in repressing social movements and stifling dissent, police have in various periods and in various countries played very problematic roles also in so-called Western liberal democracies. So I think the dilemmas we are facing in the recent case of Mark Kennedy, for example, and the infiltration of the British movement more specifically, and the anti-globalization movement in Europe more generally, is nothing new. And also all the dilemmas surrounding it are nothing new. But nevertheless, there are developments that point to the fact that this police work, in relation to social movements and in relation to political dissent, is becoming ever more pervasive, ever more preemptive. So that means that it is more subtle and therefore harder to see, and in fact undercover cops are a very good tool for doing so, and that's why I think we still see this very old method still being applied in times of internet surveillance and video cameras and you name it. I mean, there is a story that is very interesting to learn from the case of Mark Kennedy and the anti-globalization movement, and that is that indeed this apparently has been a very big operation. It was not just Mark Kennedy. There were at least several others, if not dozens others from the UK. There were at least 5 or 6 infiltrants in Germany as well. We know about one in Switzerland, Austria. Well, this shows two things. That shows indeed the threat that the anti-globalization movement apparently has been in those times around and after the Genoa G8 protests in 2001. It shows that it was not just a social movement that was suddenly coming up with a few demands, but that it had potential in terms of challenging, well, our political and economic systems and the way it was organized around the mantra of neoliberal globalization. And power holders of that time, the G8, for example, apparently felt very threatened in order to resort to such measures and to try to really systematically make this movement, to contain this movement. Well, I mean, here's a sad conclusion of my research on repression and social control of specifically the anti-globalization movement. Repression works. As soon as authorities introduce new obstacles for the collective mobilization efforts of people from below, they normally work in one way or the other. Whether it is in the intended way or not, that's the next question. But definitely repression works. So there is always a level of intimidation. There is always a level of demobilization. There is always a level even of splitting the movement, creating certain separations between various parts of the movements that any method of social control creates. The good news about that story, let's say, based on my study, is that protesters and activists, people involved in social movements, normally are creative enough to find answers, but that means to introduce new innovations, create new tactical dilemmas for authorities. Authorities normally repress in the moment that they very overtly, when they can't do elsewise anymore. So I think it is important to keep in your mind that all of this is part of interaction, and this means that once authorities repress or successfully infiltrated a movement with one or several persons for several years, that is not the end of the story. The social movement can react again and can find new ways of resisting that types of tactics or push the struggle to new terrains. But I do hope that movements, certainly in the current context of the crisis, where it seems very important again to actually organize from below in a European context, are not getting afraid, are not reacting to this initial reflex of getting intimidated and trying to reduce their overt movement activities, but actually think about how we can effectively resist such crude ways of social control.